Hello everyone, welcome. Not as yet. Hello everyone, welcome to the last session of the day. You can find this session on day 3, 30 September, talks PM. And before we start, we would like to apologize for the technical glitch we had early for the earlier morning's AM session, but we are good to go now. So we have 4 contributed talks today, and the thread for asking questions have been pinned for each speaker. Please put your questions to the speaker post the talk, and we have our conference coordinator, convener rather, Akshata Pradhan, who will help me with the introductions and the questions as well. So let's start with the first speaker for today. Hi Tarun, all set? So we have Tarun, who will speak on the use of Atlas data for bird-friendly urban planning. Tarun Menon currently works with Bird Count India and the Nature Conservation Foundation to creatively visualize and analyze citizen science data for public output. This way, he hopes to convey the importance of citizen science to the general public and thus encourage meaningful participation and engagement. His experience with citizen science is limited to a few initiatives revolving around birds, and he plans to include citizen science components to his future research. Tarun is also doing his PhD, I understand. That's what he told me, right, Tarun?
Yes.
Yeah, so okay, over to you, Tarun.
Hello everyone, I am Tarun, and on behalf of my co-authors, I'm happy to present at the Citizen Science Conference. The title of my talk is The Use of Atlas Data for Bird-Friendly Urban Planning. Cities are growing at an exponential rate. Currently, 55% of the world population is living in cities, which is set to rise to 70% by 2050. Most urban growth is happening in developing countries like India. Say, look at the city of Mysore here, where in the period of 18 years, you can see the sort of urban development that has happened. This sort of urban growth is going to be an important driver of species extinctions during this century. Urbanization acts like an environmental filter, favoring only a limited number of species, thus homogenizing biodiversity. We see specialist species replaced by fewer generalist and commensal species. However, within a city, certain areas have higher biodiversity while certain have lower. And built-up areas tend to be on the lower side of the spectrum, while gardens and lakes tend to be on the higher side. Therefore, this begs the question as to how do we maximize biodiversity within an urban context? So given the inevitability of urbanization, the objective of our study was to understand the local landscape factors that help optimize bird diversity using a systematic atlas of the city of Mysore. Why birds? In cities, birds are the most visible and relatable form of biodiversity to the general public, therefore attractive to policymakers and advocacy groups. The Mysore Bird Atlas was a pioneering effort by the citizens of the Mysore Nature group. 60 volunteers systematically documented the distribution and abundance of birds across the city. Although bird atlases have been carried out in North America, Europe, and Australia, in India we're just initiating such studies, and this was the first systematic atlas in our country. Coming to the methods, the city of Mysore was divided into 33 grid cells of approximately 2.2 by 2.2 kilometers. Each of these grid cells was further divided into 4 subcells of roughly 1.1 by 1.1 kilometers. Within each of these 132 subcells, birds were sampled in February and in June in the years of 2014, 15, and 16. Birds were surveyed for 30 minutes between 6:30 to 11 a.m. in the morning. To be able to relate bird richness to landscape features, we ran a land cover classification using Landsat 8 satellite imagery from January 2016. The city of Mysore was divided into 4 land cover classes, which included vegetation cover, which was any sort of tree or bush cover, bareground, which included open scrub along with agriculture, both active and fallow, as well as grasslands. As well, we also included built-up areas and lakes. An accuracy assessment of our land cover classification yielded a 92% accuracy along with a kappa hat value of 0.89, which is quite high. These are 4 representative images of our land cover categories, just for your reference. Coming to our analysis, each bird detected in our study was divided into 4 gills: forest generalist, open habitat, water associated, and commensal species. We then modeled gill species richness in each subgrid with the proportion of area under built-up, vegetation, bareground, and the presence and absence of water. Generalized additive models with the Poisson distribution were used for the modeling. So coming to our results and discussion, we detected 192 species over a 3-year period, out of which 64 species were forest generalists, 66 were open habitat species, 55 were waterbirds, and 7 were commensals. Although it is important to note that only 7 species of commensals represented 27% of all the birds detected. Coming to the results of our models, let me just explain this graph to you initially. Each of these graphs represents scenarios with different proportions of built-up areas. The x-axis represents species richness, while the y-axis represents the proportion of vegetation cover in the remaining area. It is important to remember that since we are working with proportions that add up to 1, which as vegetation increases, proportion of vegetation increases, the proportion of bareground decreases equally. The line represents predicted richness, along with 95% confidence intervals, while the dots represent actual richness at the subgrid level. So here we see that richness strongly decreases with built-up area. We also see with the positive slope that vegetation cover has a stronger positive effect than does bareground. But it is interesting to note that how the slope of species richness flattens out with increasing built-up area. So this actually means that with increasing built-up area, our ability to maximize species richness reduces. So at say 20% built-up area, we can maximize species richness at around 25 species if we maintain the remaining 80% of the area with trees. But at between 60 to 80% of built-up area, there is very little possibility of maximizing species richness because the slope is pretty much flat here. Coming to the results from our open habitat species models, the graph here is similar to the previous one, except here on the x-axis, bareground is replacing vegetation cover. So with increasing proportion of bareground, the proportion of vegetation is decreasing. Here again, we see that richness strongly decreases with increasing built-up area. We also see that with the positive relation of the slope, that bareground has a stronger positive effect than does vegetation. We also notice that the richness of open habitat species flattens out at about 50% of bareground. So if you want at 20% built-up area, if you wanted to maximize open habitat species richness at about 25 species, you would want to have 50% of the remaining area as bareground and about 30% of the remaining area as tree cover. But if, say, you had 80% built-up area, the remaining area of 20%, so the remaining area, would have to be open habitat. And then you would be able to conserve 15 species, open habitat species. Coming to the results from our waterbirds, analysis of our waterbird models, here we can see that the blue line represents the presence of water, while the red line represents absence of water. And as you would expect, the richness of waterbirds was greater at sites where waterbodies were present. Again, richness of waterbirds decreases with increasing built-up area. But it is interesting to note that when built-up area is lesser than 50%, we can see that it would be more beneficial to have an equal proportion of bareground and vegetation cover, and you would be able to maximize species richness at about 20 when you have 20% built-up area. But as the built-up area increases above 50%, we were to maximize waterbird richness, the remaining area needs to be vegetation, completely covered with vegetation, and you would be able to conserve maximum species richness at about say 12 species when you have 60% built up area. Coming to the learnings of our study, we find that both vegetation cover and open habitats are important for a wide variety of species. The conservation of Mysore lakes is paramount to the survival of many water-associated species, and the loss of even a couple of lakes will result in a loss of many species. It is important also to take into account the original land cover of the area earmarked for development. In most cases, this development takes place in open scrub and agricultural land, and therefore to maximize species richness, it would be important to minimize the amount of area being built up as much as possible, that is, and retain open habitat, as much open habitat as possible, and plant trees in the remaining area. So this is the kind of models that we have developed in the study to enable urban planners to plan out how much of the remaining area available post-development to be converted into, say, a tree plantation or a garden, and how much should be left as open habitat. Coming to the conclusions of our study, we find that the Mysore Bird Atlas had immense educational and recreational value. It was a successful citizen science initiative that enabled regular bird watchers to contribute towards science and produce relatively sound scientific data. By comparing across space, we're trying to make predictions over time, but this is best validated by repeated surveys over time, which will allow for more direct measurements. It is therefore crucial that the Mysore Bird Atlas be repeated more frequently, with the current one serving as a baseline, thus developing it into a pioneering, first of its kind long-term monitoring program in the country, which will lead the initiative to uncover ways in which we can make our cities more biodiversity friendly. Finally, I'd like to end with the thought that this study shows the unique power of citizen science to yield data over large spatial and temporal scales that would not be possible in any other way. Finally, coming to the acknowledgements, I would like to thank my co-authors whose initiative led to the conceptualization of the study. I would also like to thank Bird Count India and the Mysore Nature Group and all the volunteers that took part in this study. Thank you.
Thank you, Tarun. That is pretty fascinating. And we will have questions coming up in a little while. It takes a little bit of time for the questions to get posted. So in the meantime, if there's anything else that you would like to share, which you may have missed out in your recording, or any other information that you would like to give.
Yeah, I mean, I also actually had done a bit of the analysis with individual species, just in case people have an interest in specific species and what kind of how much vegetation cover, how much built up area, and how much bareground would be beneficial for individual species. But unfortunately, I mean, due to the restriction of time, I wasn't able to include those individual species analysis because I clubbed the entire group of forest generalists into like a single group which has 64 species within it. So within them, each species shows slightly different trends, but overall they kind of follow the same trend of the overall group.
So we have our first question from Paul. Paul asks that does the study using built up as a factor influencing species richness find any support for mid-disturbance hypothesis? Also,
yeah, I think,
there are two parts to it. So if you want to answer the first one, then I'll read out the second part.
No, you can complete the question and I'll answer.
Okay. The second part. So he says for mid-disturbance hypothesis, which means a species peak at intermediate, middle level of disturbance. That's his question. And also, was abundance of each species studied in relation to each category of habitat?
Okay, so to answer the first part, yes, I think there is some amount of a mid-disturbance effect where, like, when there is a certain amount of built-up area, maybe about 10 to 20%, you're seeing a slightly higher richnesses. But the thing that we need to know is that there are only 7 commensal, like urban species over here, which like your crows and your pigeons and miners. So even though there is that mid-disturbance effect, it's not very strong because the number of commensals and opportunistic species are on the lower side. But yeah, it is there. The second part of the question, did I analyze individual abundances? Yeah, I did. I didn't analyze absolute abundances, but I analyzed frequency of reporting because I wasn't too sure about the way in which the abundance was, whether it was standardized across observers, how people were counting the birds. So I just preferred to use frequency of reporting. So like if there were 4 checklists or 10 checklists, what proportion of those checklists had that species? And then I again analyze those individual species with these individual habitat variables.
So we are in the process of getting some more questions. But in the meantime, I was just looking at the data which you looked at lake areas specifically. And that kind of data is very interesting because it helps a lot in urban planning, especially when a lot of these lakes are filled up and into built up areas. So any other observation that you would like to add on the lake part?
So the lake part, that is interesting, that because the thing is that across the study period, the amount of water in the lake tends to change. So for the purposes of the study, that's why rather than using amount of water, I use just the presence and absence of a lake, because even the presence of a little amount of water actually like adds the number of species. It doesn't need to be water, but if there's some sort of a wetland, a lot of grasses and like any sort of growth even in the lake bed, you have a lot of species added. And yeah, I do agree that these lakes are very important because you fill up a couple of lakes and there's a whole ecosystem associated with these lakes. There's like, I don't remember the number that I mentioned in the talk, it was about 45 species of waterbirds, which are very strongly associated with the lake. So if you lose those lakes, you see a strong decline in the number of birds that you would see in the city actually. You have a lot of your winter migrants that are also birds that visit lakes. So as soon as you lose your lakes, you lose a lot of your winter migrants.
That's right. And also a lot of temperature regulation for a city, which is very important. Yeah. Okay, so we have a question up here from Vidya Swaminathan. She says, considering the time of day during which the birds were recorded, I suppose the atlas doesn't include any nocturnal birds. Is there a plan to design a study that takes them into consideration in the future?
I'm not sure whether there's any plans to consider that in the future because since this entire study was done by volunteers, and I'm not sure how easy it would be to convince people to go. Anyway, within the city, it may be easy, like within the residential areas, but going into the more wilder areas post dark might be a little challenging. I'm sure we might try this, but it's not easy.
Because normally when we do take up studies like if you're doing a biodiversity study and all, we normally would do nocturnal studies. But if you expect citizens to go out, we do not know what is the safety and security for these.
Exactly.
Definitely that part, maybe a specific study undertaken just to do nocturnal work, then maybe that might give some interesting results. So we are waiting for some more questions on the channel, and if there is, we have just a moment. Okay, so Tarun, if you say you are part of Bird Count India, and I remember the morning Ashwin also was supposed to talk something about the state atlas, status of birds of India, the book which was brought out. So have you been part of it, and do you have any inputs to give on that?
Actually, I joined the Bird Count India around the time they were publishing the State of India's birds, so I wasn't really involved in the analysis and all of that. But I have some sort of knowledge of what was done. I mean, if there are specific questions related to that, maybe I can answer, but yeah, I don't have specific inputs from there.
Thank you, Tarun. I'm sure that we'll get some more questions on the channel. So please stay around and to answer the questions, because post-lunch sessions are a bit difficult for people. So I'm sure they're all warming up to it. And
Yes.
thank you so much. And we look forward to you staying around here to answer the questions on the channel. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you.